Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We are in conversation today with Professor Brij Tankha, Professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at Delhi University. And we are going to be talking about the new government thrown up by the elections in Japan, which has seen for one of the very few times in the last 50 odd years a party in power other than the Liberal Democratic Party. So, Brij, what do you think is the significance of this? And in particular, how much of a change is this actually going to bring in Japanese politics, apart from the nomenclature of the parties concerned?
Well, the answering the second part of your question, it would be a major coup, as it were, if one knew the answer clearly. But certainly, to begin with the first, the significance, it's of great significance. I think in some ways, it probably even surprised the Japanese. And it, there are about 300 seats they won, right. Over 308 seats. So it was a massive victory. And I think there's a general consensus that there was a signal or a demand or a desire for change. And this is reflects this. There's a huge dissatisfaction with the LDP and their, crony politics, their actually very lackluster performance in the last decade or so, their inability to address various issues. So there is a huge pent-up desire for change. So this, in that sense, this is a major turning point, I would imagine.
Right. In terms of the campaign that went before the elections, the Democratic Party campaigned on a major change in the whole structure and style of Japanese politics, run by the bureaucracy, run by conservative establishment figures, and promised a change, which obviously resonated with the Japanese public. But the Democratic Party also campaigned for substantive changes in the economy, measures to get Japan out of the, some say, the biggest depression since the war. Do you think this, how do you see the Democratic Party being able to really transform the Japanese economy in this context?
Well, it's a difficult challenge. I think their demand or their platform, when they said that they wanted change, for instance, in reducing the role of the bureaucracy, right. They seem to have already put that in place. They put restrictions on what bureaucrats can say to the newspapers. For instance, it was very common for leading members of the bureaucracy to make statements to the press, which is usually not done elsewhere.
Quite.
But now they've been issued a gag order, I believe. Ambassadors can't just make statements on their own and so forth. So that signals a change. On the economy, it's a tougher battle, obviously. As you said, there's been a long decade or two of deep depression, I think, hollowing out in some ways. Industries move to places like China and so forth. So there's an aging population. So the tax base is narrow, and their ability to support increasing social expenditure is very difficult. So that is an extremely difficult challenge. But he is addressing the issue, and that's where he'll have to prove himself. They have another strategy, which they call hunting for hidden treasure, right. Which is there are lots of hidden sort of savings lying around, and they think they can actually put these to productive use. Right. And they, quite rightly, they want to support social spending. So, for instance, child support, child maintenance is going to be increased. One very popular measure is, or maybe populist measure, is either reducing or cutting out highway tariffs. Right. So, which will reduce travel costs and
the reform of the pension system.
Pension system is also. They argue that it's possible to restructure it in a way where you can provide a safety net for the people.
It was interesting that in the run-up to the elections, the new Prime Minister Hatoyama, at least in the West, had developed a bit of a reputation as being a left-wing character. And people were quoting from articles he had written. Newsweek called him a left bank intellectual, where he was known to have talked about the evils of globalization. He talked about finance capital and its problems. But once he is in power, how do you see this unfolding? Can we really think that the Democratic Party in Japan would adopt left-leaning politics, or would it be a marginal shift away from the market-driven politics of the LDP?
Well, in the United States, I think anyone who says in favor of, let's say, the metric system becomes left. In Japan, Hatoyama is and his family are known as the Kennedys. They are compared with the Kennedys. So I think he's more of a liberal. Of course, he's in the, I think, New York Times article, he had written a critique of globalization, masquerading, American policy masquerading as globalization. So I think there is a constituency in Japan, liberal constituency, which has problems with that. I don't think he's going to change the American alliance. After all, his political mentor and the key man in the party is Ozawa.
That's right.
And he's the man who won the elections, if you will, through his campaigning and so forth. And he had written a book earlier about Japan being a normal country.
Right.
So I think we will see some renegotiations, perhaps, and which would be good for East Asia and the region.
Would it be incorrect to say that Ozawa, for example, that there is a line where Japanese nationalism and some of this center-left ideology of resistance to globalization intersect?
Yes, I think so. And I think it's in a positive way, because I think with the LDP and the conservative forces, there is also a nationalism at work there. But it's a nationalism which is contentious because it glosses over the past, the historical wrongs to its neighbors and so forth. Whereas here, I think it's on a more liberal basis. And it is, in that sense, perhaps it has more possibilities, which would be positive.
So in this context, also, the Democratic Party platform before the elections also spoke of revisiting, if you like, the Japan-US relationship, which I would think, in any case, more than a decade after the end of the Cold War, certainly requires some re-evaluation, particularly in the context of the emergence of such a strong China in the region. While there was some talk even of renegotiating the presence of 50,000 US troops in Japan, how do you see this unfolding in the years to come?
Well, two things. One, certainly China is the main focus for Japanese foreign policy. The Okinawan issue and the American alliance, I think, is a alliance issue as well as a local problem, because the Okinawans don't want, and they have problems with the bases.
And that's been there for some time.
Yeah. So what they're talking about is relocation and reduction. And so the relocation is equally important, I think, because there are economic benefits to having the bases there. So I don't think it is a total change in the alliance, but as I said, renegotiating the terms of this alliance.
Maybe a focus
will change. And as far as China goes, I think that it clearly is the focal point. After all, Japan has very strong economic relations with China, despite whatever other problems they continue to have. So they have to learn to deal with and reduce the other tensions, which are possible if they rethink their positions on Yasukuni Shrine, the whole war issue.
That's right.
Which is, to my mind, is doable. From the Indian perspective, we don't know really what Hatoyama thinks of this region. He has made some general statements. But I think personally, I don't know about the Indian government's position, but I think from a Japanese perspective, as an Indian looking at the Japanese, I think they need to build up their East Asia community. But I think they also need to think a little more broadly, because China is not just an East Asian power. After all, it's it's a much larger Asian power, and there is an Asian context within which a trilateral relationship between China, India and Japan would be very productive. We already have dialogue with Russia, China and India going on, which was track 2 changed into an official level dialogue. So I think this would be a very welcome step if they actually extend this East Asia dialogue into one where India also plays a role, which I think will be very beneficial both for India as well as for Japan.
So I think the years to come would really see this trajectory unfolding, and we would have to wait and see how far the inertia that has been built up in Japanese politics over the last 5 decades or more resists these changes, and how much these changes actually play themselves out in the changing dynamics of this region and of the world. Professor Tankha, thank you very much.
Thank you.